Okay, all right. I'd like to welcome you to our public forum, and tonight it's on Brownsfield Community-Wide Assessment Program, and this is Wednesday, February 6th, 2019. The time is 6:04 p.m., and we have Seth Otto from Mall Foster Longe, who's here to present the overview on what we have tonight. So if Seth, I could hand this over to you, and you can tell us a little about MFA and your role as well.
Sure. I don't. Is it okay if I'm positioned?
You can talk to him.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. Right. Yeah. These guys like to direct my attention out this way. So thank you, counselors. It's great to be here. A lot of familiar faces. Again, my name is Seth. My last name is Otto, and I'm with the consulting firm Mall Foster Longe. We are a local environmental engineering, science, and planning firm, and have had the fortune of working here in this community for almost 6 years on various different projects. And tonight I'm presenting on a relatively new program that the city has initiated with the help of some funding from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. So generally speaking, I think we can keep this kind of loose. If you have questions, feel free to raise your hand. It doesn't need to be too formal as far as I'm concerned, unless that breaks with protocol. But we're a small group, so just please interrupt with questions. So the agenda for tonight, we've gone through the welcome. I'm going to give a basic overview on what a brownfield is for those of you that maybe are new to the topic. Give a little bit of background on what's been done so far in St. Helens. We'll talk about the community-wide assessment grant and the role of St. Helens community in that. We'll talk about site selection and then next steps as we move forward into this project. Raise your hand if you're familiar with the term brownfields. Is that something that, okay, so we've got a knowledgeable audience. I'll move through this quickly. The EPA, the official definition is basically a piece of real estate property that is negatively impacted by the presence or perceived presence of environmental contamination. And that caveat of perceived or potential presence is important because sometimes the stigma is enough to impact the sale or reuse of a property. And that relates to historic uses, relates to current uses in some cases, and it also relates to handling of materials that may or may not have been part of the historic use, and we'll get into that. So contamination, again, basically hazardous materials and petroleum. Those are two different buckets that we look at with this program. So a site or the contamination on a site will either be defined as broadly as a hazardous material or specifically as a petroleum-related product. And that's important really only to the federal government, but it impacts how the funding is used. Cleanup or remediation, that depends on how the property is going to be used. That generally means removing the contaminated material and replacing it with clean material, treating it in place through some technology, or capping it and leaving it. And again, that just depends on how the property is going to be reused. If you're putting a nursery or a daycare in, most likely you're going to clean it up to the highest standard. And then another term of art here is breaking the pathways of exposure, and that's really what they're concerned about, is making sure that humans and the natural environment are not negatively impacted by any source of contamination on a property. That's really the objective of brownfield cleanup. That and putting real estate, real property back into productive use. So what types of properties are brownfield? The most common are gas stations and dry cleaners. Those are, 65% of contaminated properties in our communities are former gas stations and dry cleaners. I guess I'm young enough that I don't have that much experience with this, but I guess at one time in our history, cars were so inefficient that there were gas stations at practically every intersection. And as you start digging around in smaller communities, especially communities on highways, you'll find a lot of former gas stations. And dry cleaners. Dry cleaners are a real source of contamination due mainly to poor practices, poor management of the solvents that are used in the cleaning process. Why do these sites require outside funding? Typically because the market is not operating in a way that will clean them up. There's an extra cost. So if a real estate broker or developer is looking at two different properties and one's clean and one has environmental stigma, you can imagine that they'll go with the clean one. So there's typically funding from the state, local government, federal government that helps level the playing field and address some of the environmental issues that negatively impact brownfield properties. That's an odd one. We'll skip that one. So what does contaminated property mean for the property owner? Generally, if you owned the property, you operated the business during the time that the contamination occurred, you are liable for it. And that's a big deal, and that impacts a lot of property reuse because owners who have that liability may not be interested in doing assessment or cleanup or bringing attention to the property. And again, so there are mechanisms in place to help kind of cover the liability that a property owner may have associated with their former use of the property, and that's another thing that we'll get into. So typical types of contamination that you'd find, hazardous material in the soil. This is very common, particularly with underground storage tanks, leaking petroleum tanks, things like that. Groundwater is another frequently contaminated media. This shows a plume of solvents from a dry cleaning site. I like this one because it illustrates, I guess this doesn't show on the screen, but it illustrates the impact that a small site can have on an entire neighborhood. If you look down in the bottom right corner, that small parcel with the dots on it is the former dry cleaner site, but that plume has extended out under 65 residential homes and multiple businesses. So you can have a significant impact from a very small property. I don't know if I need this. Yes. Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay. Another common area of impacted real estate property would be hazardous building materials. Most common would be asbestos-containing material, tiles, roof tiles, insulation, and lead-based paint. Both regulated substances that are really common in buildings that predate mid-1980s. And then the last one that's less common but has significant impacts in our region is sediment contamination. And this is where hazardous materials, typically through runoff and drainage, bind with the soils, the wet soils underwater in our rivers and streams. And that's the main issue in, say, the Portland Harbor Superfund is contaminated sediment. So how does this process proceed? Moving from assessment, you start with a phase 1 environmental site assessment. Many of you may have heard of that. If you've been involved in a property transaction with commercial property, your lender may have required you to get a phase 1. If that phase 1 identifies environmental conditions, you would move to the phase 2, which is the actual site sampling, field work, collecting samples, taking them to the lab. And then if there is a sufficient amount of hazardous material that requires cleanup, you would move through a feasibility study or analysis of brownfield cleanup alternatives. Those are more or less the same thing, where generally you're looking at alternatives. What is the cleanup going to require? What is the cost? And then you do a cost-benefit analysis and make a decision for a cleanup action plan. The cleanup action plan lays out the work, defines the amount of material that will be cleaned, where it goes, and then what the site condition is when you leave it. And then that's closed out with a letter of no further action from DEQ. And another tool in the toolbox for dealing with brownfields is the prospective purchaser agreement, which DEQ undersigns transfer of property, and essentially when the cleanup occurs, it clears the property owners of liability for future damages. again, purpose of a phase one. The phase one is unique if it's done according to the federal standards. It provides a property purchaser with legal defense through the all appropriate inquiry standard. So again, that's why it's typically required in commercial transactions. It can help support a business decision around a property if there is an environmental condition or suspected environmental condition. It's an important part of property feasibility. Again, lenders require it. And as we'll see later, if you're going to use funds from the EPA Brownfield grant, you'll have to have done a phase one before you acquired the property. Phase one, this is something that folks don't often know, DEQ does not require you to do a phase one. DEQ will not require anybody to have a phase one done. If they suspect contamination, they will go straight to the phase two. What does a phase one do? It's a review of environmental records, review of historical land use sources. So is there anything historically that was on the site that might have contributed to contamination there? Again, gas station, maybe a machine shop, something like that. There's a site visit, interview former operators, owners, and then it's a report that again follows a prescribed standard. This is an example here in this image of an old, I think this is a creamery, and what they found was that there's record in the insurance map of where they had fueling tanks, and that's an indication of where there might be contamination. Again, so what do you get from a phase one? It identifies the recognized environmental conditions, and those, again, can be current or historical on the site. So maybe there's drums there that they observe, or looking at the insurance records, they see that there was an historic use that might have led to contamination. The photo on the left there is interesting. This is something that often trips up property owners. That you see there's a dry well there. If there's a dry well on a property and it's not been registered, and 99% of them are not registered with DEQ, that will get flagged up as a recognized environmental condition and something that'll have to get cleared up. One of those kind of hidden surprises that often trip up property transactions. Any questions about the phase one? Okay, the phase two. So let's say you've done a phase one. You found that there's some concern about it, maybe historic uses on the site. You identify an area where you might do investigation, and so you develop a sampling and analysis plan, and technicians go out in the field to sample. Typically it's soil and groundwater, depending on the historic use and the contaminants of concern, and they'll do a certain amount of samples. Generally you're not doing like Swiss cheese across the site. It's particular areas where it's justified that there's concern for contamination. Site work goes to a laboratory analysis comes back, the environmental scientists evaluate the data and make a determination as to whether or not either more data is needed or cleanup is needed, or what was found on the site does not rise to the level of something that would require remediation or abatement. Then the next step is the feasibility study. Again, so if there is enough contamination that it justifies cleanup, you would go through an evaluation process looking at long-term risk, short-term risk, and the cost analysis. One thing that's important to note, in Oregon, we're somewhat unique nationally in that we have what's called risk-based corrective action, which sort of jargony for you clean it up to the level that the reuse demands. Again, so like the analogy I used earlier, if you're putting in a residential use or a daycare or something like that, it's got to have to be really, really clean. But if the future use of the site is industrial or it's a parking lot, oftentimes there's a fair amount of contaminated media that can actually remain on the site. And that's important when you're doing your cleanup feasibility study. And then the cleanup action plan. So then you select a preferred cleanup approach, you hire an engineer, they do the design report, and you develop plans and specifications. And I'm going through all of this detail because these are the things that the Brownfield grant that the city has will pay for. So all these activities are eligible cost activities under the city's Brownfield grant. So you can actually take a property all the way up to having an engineering design report for cleanup. But you cannot actually do the cleanup with this grant, and that's an important caveat. However, there are lots of other funding sources from the state. Actually, you can go back to EPA. There are other places to get funding for cleanup. Once you have that, and so that would be the remedy implementation. That would be the next step beyond where the current brownfield program goes. So a little background on brownfield planning up to date in St. Helens. Starting several years ago, actually, when the veneer mill on the waterfront closed, the city had really started thinking proactively about reusing the waterfront and acquired that property and the Boise Cascade property and the lagoon in between, and initiated a very serious waterfront redevelopment and cleanup process. Some of you may have been involved in that. There's been multiple community meetings, design charrettes, workshops. A framework plan for the veneer site has been developed. Cities entered into a development agreement with the developer on a portion of it. So things on the waterfront are moving. Luckily, on that property, environmental contamination is not an impediment. There are areas of concern, but again, in that case, the redevelopment is going to drive the cleanup of those properties. So coming back to the community-wide assessment grant that is in place now, it's a US EPA funded program. It provides money for an inventory, the environmental site investigations that I went over, cleanup planning, community engagement, and then there's also some funding available for site-specific real estate market analysis and area-wide planning. So if there is a property or an area of properties within the city that warrant additional investigation about redevelopment and reuse, the grant provides funding for that as well. Primary objective really is to identify priority brownfield sites within the community, work with property owners to address those issues, and move them back into beneficial reuse. The target area, and this is not to say that the funds are entirely intended to be used in this area, but this is where the city is emphasizing its outreach and engagement with property owners. The orange on here coincides with the urban renewal area that was recently adopted. So all these properties are within the city's urban renewal district. That's not to say, again, that properties that aren't necessarily in the orange highlight aren't eligible or wouldn't be good candidates to participate in the program, but this is where the focus is. So along the commercial corridor on Columbia Boulevard, the historic downtown, and obviously the industrial district to the south and out Columbia River Highway and Old Portland Road. So this coincides with areas that the city and the state, frankly, are investing quite a bit of money into improving and addressing environmental contamination. Overall schedule for the program. So we started, this is a little bit outdated. We really got going more like second quarter 2018, so some of this is pushed forward. But we've convened a Brownfield Advisory Committee, completed an inventory of sites within the community, worked with the Advisory Committee on site prioritization and identification, and have started outreach. We've also started work on a high priority site on the waterfront that I'll talk about, and we're now having, this is really our first open community event. Yeah. Oh, I'll get to that actually. Yeah. Good question. Yeah, I've got a slide for that. So some of this implies that this is a fairly linear process, but a lot of the grant eligible activities can happen at any time, really. So if there are sites that are priority or just interested in participating in the program, they can come forward to the city, and we'll talk about how property owners engage with city staff on this. So the role of the community, again, to participate in identifying priority targets and outcomes for the use of EPA funds. So the city really wants to hear from you on your objectives for where the funds should be used, what properties might benefit from this. this isn't like a call out your neighbor situation, but there may be concerns within the community, or maybe you have a friend, and this is a good way to address some longstanding sources of blight or concern within the community. So we're having this community open house tonight, and then there'll be another targeted meeting with business and property owners that are within the target area, and then there'll be another opportunity for engagement when we do commence an area-wide planning project. The Brownfield Advisory Committee, so to your question, intended to give a broad representation of both the public and private sector operating within the community. So we've got elected officials from the City of St. Helens. We have a representative from Planning Department, Public Works. We have a Columbia County Commissioner. We have someone from the Port of St. Helens, Public Health Foundation of Columbia County, the CCET, and then one or two citizens at large. I can't remember now. Just one, right? Yeah. Am I missing anybody? No. Okay. So does that answer your question? Yeah. And these meetings are public, and generally they're, it's kind of an update on what's happening so far, looking at priority sites, talking about specific outreach. So that's the intent. Again, we've had a kickoff meeting. We've gone through the property selection. We'll be reconvening the group soon to talk through assessment results from our first property assessment. And then the last meeting later this year will fold back into area-wide planning results from a targeted planning project. This is very wordy. All of this is to say that, again, the city's focused on properties that have a good public benefit, have a positive impact on the community, prioritizing projects that focus on employment uses, that have the right zoning, and that don't have impediments in place that otherwise prohibit redevelopment. And this is echoed in the prioritization that the Brownfield Advisory Committee has put forward in their site selection process. So again, the advisory committee has developed evaluation criteria for evaluating eligible properties. We've done an inventory of DEQ sites in the community, and we've started to hone down those priority sites that meet their criteria for receiving grant funding. So just a reminder of the target area. In that, we've identified a total of 883 properties that meet the city's baseline criteria. So they're zoned commercial or industrial. They are within the urban renewal area. That's total properties. Of those total properties, 43 are in a DEQ database as an identified environmentally contaminated site. 114 meet general characteristics of sites that may warrant further investigation due to former use, due to current use, due to any historical information that's been available, and also due to environmental professional site observation. So we've done windshield surveys through the entire area and just kind of marked off sites that maybe looks like there's a machine shop or there's some questionable drums or something like that. So nothing that would mark it as a brownfield per se, but something that a environmental professional can justifiably identify as an issue of concern. 181 are unknown. There just was not enough information. Then this central residential, St. Helens is kind of unique in that there are a lot of residential units, houses in the central business district in areas that are zoned commercial. So there's a concern that there may have been former commercial uses on those properties that would warrant further investigation. So that's just a special category that we've called out. And then of the 886, 393, we feel just, based on current and former use and information we have, are just sort of not in the category of warranting further investigation. So quite a few sites to work through, quite a lot of priority targets here, and that's why the criteria is important, so that the city is using the funding according to the goals and objectives of the grant. So what makes a property eligible? It's an innocent landowner, and that means, as I alluded to before, that there's no chain tracing the property owner back to any activity on the site that contributed to contamination. And that can be shown through a prospective purchaser agreement with DEQ, or through a chain of title, or completion of a Phase 1 site assessment. Other eligible properties include a contiguous property owner, so if there's a property that's negatively impacted by a neighboring property, that contiguous property is eligible, and then public governments are also eligible, particularly if a property was acquired through foreclosure, bankruptcy, etc. Again, the priorities defined by the advisory committee include high-profile, visible properties that would lead to commercial and employment or development opportunities, that any that pose a direct threat to human health due to the contamination present, the sites that have a potential for future public access, so open space or greenway, anything like that. Obviously, the willingness of the property owner to participate is a huge criteria. The city can't compel anybody to do a Phase 1 or Phase 2. So willingness is a huge eligibility criteria. And then that the investment of the funds from the program can have a demonstrable outcome. So there's a return on that investment in terms of jobs or property tax, anything, something like that. Or if it's not a tangible result, it's amount of green space or, I don't know, things like that. So this is where I would pose a question to you, if there are other evaluation criteria that you think are important. If the community has, you as members of the community have anything that you feel is missing here, anything that St. Helens should be focusing on.
One of the things that St. Helens put in place in 1913, one of the things that St. Helens put in place in 1913 is a combined sewer system which has been updated. And there's stuff in the ground. How does that fit in any of this criteria?
That's an interesting question. The date you said was
13 was when our combined sewer system was put in, and that's mainly from 4th Street to the river, going to Godfrey Park, where at one time we just dumped stuff into the river. But there was a combined sewer system that was stormwater and sanitary, and it's been relined in '09, but there's stuff in the ground. One of the things there in that area, there was a large livery stable, and the groundwater still smells of what you find in horse stalls.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if a property owner felt that their property was negatively impacted by that, they could potentially be eligible for site assessment. It would have to... that material that you're describing is, human and animal waste is not a regulated substance. So there's no, EPA is typically concerned about cleaning up regulated substances. So petroleum, dioxins, PCBs, things like that. Human waste is not regulated in that same way. So I'm not sure that you would be looking at maybe a claim or a cleanup process that would be covered under this program.
Well, if you take a look at some of the old pictures, the human waste was outhouses in some of these areas prior to that, and there were blacksmith shops and so on well before they even invented dioxins and so on.
Right.
So when you say regulated, these operations were well before any regulation whatsoever.
Right. And that can be a challenge too, right? When operations predate regulations that would otherwise control their their use. Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting situation. I think it's worth evaluating. I know there are brownfield cleanup projects around the state where curing and tanning operations were in place, and those are some of the dirtiest sites around. That's more animal, actual carcass cleanup. But also, those are eligible for EPA funds. So it's worth looking at. I think you just have to have a property owner interested in doing the assessment work. So one project that we're wrapping up right now, this is part of the former Boise white paper, Boise, or now Cascade Tissue property down on the waterfront. Just to orient you, there's the Multnomah Channel on the bottom right, and the wastewater lagoon toward the top, port property to the left there, and then a large public green space kind of off to the upper left. So the site that we're looking at is within that dotted line at the bottom there. This is called the former South 80 landfill. This is an area where mill operations basically disposed of a lot of mill byproduct. So there's a lot of old machinery and industrial byproduct, generally speaking. Some construction disposal waste and things like that. There is an expanding business on that property and interest in building actually on top of the landfill. The landfill's been closed and is essentially has regulatory closure from DEQ. So the question just is what's within the landfill and is it suitable for construction? And so that's been the kind of the main point of our investigation, looking at the subsurface conditions, doing subslab air vapor intrusion investigations on the buildings that are there currently. So are any of the gases associated with the decomposing material in the landfill, are they infiltrating the buildings and are they safe for habitation? And then is there anything in the exterior air that poses a threat to human health? Our investigation is not complete, but preliminary results show that it is suitable for industrial occupation, that with the right venting controls, the buildings are entirely safe for the operations that are out there, and that with the right geotechnical precautions made, construction can occur on top of the landfill. So it's good outcome here. Next steps.
I want to go back to safe operations. The gas that's coming out of the ground into the space is no problem for humans. What happens if the product that is being generated in that space can absorb and change it to a dangerous compound? You're not interested in, when you qualify an area, what it would do to the materials being processed there?
So the exterior gas is not an element of concern. Interior gas also, there's no vapor penetration into the buildings. And any new construction, if constructed properly, would include vapor control measures to ensure that no gas permeates into the building.
Okay, as compared to some gas, but not dangerous to humans. It has to be no gas.
Well, ideally it would be no gas, but in order to meet DEQ's standard for safe occupancy of the building, there's probably there probably is some gas. You can't prohibit that. I mean, there's just gas all around us.
But if you're worried about things like pharmaceuticals, a little bit of gas combining with what the operations being in there, you come up with a relatively nasty product. Again, the levels that will be used get to be fairly minute, but the people making it have no problem. That's really the question. Contaminating the product that's being made in there.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I guess that's a question for the operator.
Okay.
Yeah. So next steps, where we're headed here, again, the city is looking for eligible and interested property owners to connect. Jenny Dimshow is the main contact, and we're again looking for sites that have been negatively impacted by gas stations, dry cleaners, machine shops, anything that may pose an impediment to redevelopment. Yeah. Okay. Well, good question. So, yeah, if a property owner is interested in participating, the first step is an eligibility form. It gets completed, and then it goes to EPA, and they're just making sure their main concern is that funding from the grant doesn't go to a responsible party, to someone who's done the contamination. So they'll do a basic background check and approve it. They're generally a couple of weeks for that. And then if it's approved, if it's a phase one site assessment, phase one site assessments usually take 3 weeks. That's kind of industry standard. The phase two, that's hard to predict. It just depends on the size of the property, the kind of contaminants that are, of concern, the scale of investigation. A quick one would be maybe 2 weeks to mobilize a team, 3 weeks for the laboratory results, a week to write it up. So all told, you're looking at 4 months, from coming into the system, getting the paperwork started, doing the background research, to having an investigation completed. That's a pretty reasonable time frame. Any questions? Oh yeah, thanks. So we've got a brochure that explains, again, a lot of what I went over tonight. So if you guys would take one and hand it on to any interested neighbors or friends that you have, that'd be great. Just provides a couple of examples of brownfield success stories in other communities, the key components of the program here, and then how to learn more and get in touch with Jenny for additional resources. That's a good example, right? So that's a site that there's known contamination, but it's an eligible property because the proper due diligence, the phase one, was done in advance of the acquisition. So that's, sorry? It's eligible? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if the city had not done that, had not done the proper, all appropriate inquiry phase one, it would not be eligible.
Seth?
Yeah.
I'm curious about our fire district, and do they, when we have a burn in our city or our community, and there's known lead-based paint all over the home, interior, exterior. There's known asbestos. They put out the fire. All of that material stays within now does a fire district and somehow make a report and in terms of accountability have a record of that as a contaminant? Do you know?
I don't know offhand. I don't think that's typical. That it's not their job to do that. And they're not legally required to do that.
So what happens then, and I know that there's probably some realtors in here, that what happens then to any kind of assessment on that property once that a building has burned? Who is responsible for the contaminant study on that, or the possible potential contaminants that pulveted into
the property owner? Yeah. And that goes to whatever chemicals are in the fire retardant that the fire department sprays in there. It's on the property owner.
Property owner at the time, or the property owner who just happens to buy it
without
knowing?
Yeah, that's part of the caveat emptor. That's why the phase one is necessary in order to give that purchaser protection. Yep. That's a big one. Well, consideration in what regard? I mean, yeah, high priority. Yeah. So if there's suspected groundwater impact, that would be a high priority site. Absolutely. Yeah.
We need to get him on the record. Can you send that out to him, Seth?
I believe the city's got a water well, a reserve well, or a backup well. Keith, you spoke with me a couple years ago when I asked about the well. Sorry, I don't remember the number, but it's out near Scappoose Bay. And we're still using it as a potential backup.
Keith.
And I think you told me it was taken out of service because it tasted funny.
So I'm going to refer you to Sue on this one.
And I believe it's very close to potential contaminant sources. So is that possible to investigate that location?
He's referring to what we call the Bayport well. It's out near Bayport Marina. It's been tested for every possible thing, but it does tend to have taste and odor issues when we put it online. So it is just sitting right now. We're permitted as an emergency water source only. It does not need to be treated. It only chlorinated if we use it for drinking water, which we did for years. But it's never tested positive for any type of contaminants.
Okay. I wasn't sure from some of the paperwork that I read. Is it close to what they refer to as the Miller land disposal site?
I have no idea where that is.
Okay. Thanks.
Questions on time. We have a number of places in town. There used to be mills that no longer exist. In fact, a lot of people don't even know we had another town around here. How do these old sites, that obviously well before any regulation, how do they play into this business?
If there's no current property owner, or there's a number of ways. Some of them are considered orphan sites, and there's a special DEQ program for those, where there's no current responsible property owner, and so DEQ just treats them as kind of independent sites, and will help with the cleanup. Oftentimes, those properties, though, there's a chain of title with them, and that may link to the current property owner, or it may not. It just depends on how transactions happened over the years. Are you referring to sites that maybe have no viable property owner?
Well, yeah. If you go along this side of the railroad from Columbia Boulevard over to the old Portland Road, there used to be some mills there making barrels and so on. The other group of areas that have had industrial things on it, right now we have land to the water, but a lot of the slough area was on pilings for a long ways back, and it was just more convenient to fill it in. But there were many hundreds of acres where the industrial property was on pilings, and that no longer exists. Now and then you can find pilings around, because our waterfront, because of the dams, has changed rather drastically. And the question is, on those sites, because some of them are just underwater now at high tide, how do they play into this? Because I don't know if there's any way to track.
Well, any property that's below ordinary high water is considered land of the state, and so those are regulated by DSL, and they're handled differently. They're typically not eligible for this program. and the cleanup is handled differently through a DEQ sediment cleanup program. Yeah.
What if a property's in a flood
If a
zone?
property's in the flood zone, that is not necessarily an issue. It's ordinary high water is the mark, and those don't always correspond. In fact, they typically don't. So if it's in a flood zone, I think that's completely eligible.
So like the lagoon, would it be available? Will it be eligible?
Yes.
Sorry, I have
Yes.
to repeat it for the record.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not trying to mock you. I'm really not. I know it probably seemed like that. Dawned on me.
You get to brush up on your mocking skills.
Let's look at the lagoon a minute. Once upon a time, that was below river level. That was the Frogmore Slough. It's been raised. Who handles that, or is it where it is now?
Where it is now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions for Seth?
Yes. So the question was the mechanics of the grant. And the grant was awarded, I believe, is fiscal year 2017, but there's always a lag in terms of developing the contract. And so the period initiated in 2018, beginning of 2018. It ends fourth quarter of 2019. There's an optional 1-year extension. Yes, 300? Yeah, 300,000. And of that, about 50% has been expended. Yep. So the question is there a cap on the amount that can be spent per property? And officially, there's no formal cap established in the grant program, but the city and the advisory committee have the authority to determine how much any given property can get, and they can ask for a match. That hasn't happened, but that's within their right to do that.
So
From the property owner, just depending on the context. I mean, that's not written into. Some communities do that; they require a match from the property owner. St. Helens is not doing that, but it's within their agreement with EPA that they can do that. That's right.
Seth, I've got a question for our staff. Do we have our on our website the advisory committee information, and do we have a calendar for the advisory committee?
Yeah, so on the back of the brochure, there's a project website, and we've uploaded the 2 advisory committee meetings. Both have notes and attendance lists, and then any future advisory committee meeting is always announced on that website. The advisory committee meetings are intended to advise on brownfields. They're not intended for just general public, but we always upload our notes.
And they're advertised as well in the paper, the newspaper?
The advisory committee meetings?
Yes. But
We
they
don't-
are public meetings?
Yes, anyone can attend, and they're always on our city calendar.
Okay.
I had a question. And I'm not, I've never been part of one that was open-ended like this. To the man's point about where we are on the total expenditure, if we get to the end of the grant and there's a target property that comes forward, or a landlord or a property owner that's slow to come forward, and it's a place of interest, is there programs that could scoop that one up, or is there other programs like, wait, we missed this one, but they've ran out of money, we really want to help them get this last piece, this is an important piece of their main street or whatever? Is there programs for anybody left? Say it's going to take $325,000 for us to get there. Is there a program at the end of the money for future projects?
So there are programs available through the state. Would be the best next source if you wound up in a situation like that in the middle of a project. So Business Oregon has a brownfield program that's funded by the state, and they have money available for everything from assessment to cleanup. So that's another good source of filling a gap like that.
Yeah, I just thought I would hate to have somebody come to the process late, or all of a sudden somebody we didn't even know was interested, and the window of opportunity closed on them to leave them hanging out there.
Right. Well, so there is the ability to extend the grant. So if there is money available still in the grant, you can extend that. You can go back to EPA. There's an annual application process, and presumably St. Helens will go back once, they're at a point now where they're eligible to go back. You have to expend a certain amount of funds.
Yeah, I'm because as the testimonies indicated, we've had a lot of industrial development here that has gone away. And so there's untapped things that need to be dealt with. And so to think that we can do that all in a year is overly optimistic. So, just a continuing process of cleaning things up for redevelopment and revitalization.
Just speaking for Jenny here, I think the intent is that this becomes a long-term sustainable program. It's not just a one-off with this grant. Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect.
If we get a surplus of willing property owners and they meet our eligibility requirements, we'll reapply to this program and get more money.
Awesome. Because I just don't want to see any property left blank because they feel left out. Yeah. They're like, I can't get over the hump,
Yeah, I was just going to comment that it was, this is part of a larger economic development strategy to remove redevelopment barriers, basically, from properties to help facilitate them, get those questions answered, and get them more suitable and ready for development. And to the extent we only, we had 300,000 this time.
A little bit at a time.
See how the program grows. It seems to be going well.
Super.
Okay, well, if there are no more questions, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. Glad everybody stayed mostly awake, and look forward to hearing from any interested folks out there.
Thank you, Seth. Yep. No, don't. Just leave it on. Yep.
Yeah, we have a regular meeting, starts in 5 minutes.
Oh. This forum's closed.